In this video, we will be delving into the history of anthropomorphic animal xenofiction. And so, before we begin, I think it will be helpful to lay down some definitions. While there are numerous ways to classify works of animal xenofiction, or stories told from the perspective of non-human animals, I myself prefer to divide them up based on whether or not the characters are portrayed as physically realistic or human-like. The former, including everything from White Fang and the Fox and the Hound to Watership Down and the Warriors series, I label naturalist animal xenofiction, and I have an entire recently remastered video on the subject for those interested. While the latter, such as Redwall or The Wind in the Willows, I label anthropomorphic, which I feel requires some clarification. Anthropomorphization simply means giving human traits to non-human things, be they living creatures, objects, or even concepts. And this includes cognitive traits. So, technically speaking, even though the rabbits of Watership Down remain physically realistic, the fact that they possess human-style language, culture, and mental faculties means that they, too, are anthropomorphized, even if in a different manner than Ratty, Mrs. Frisbee, or Martin the Warrior. But when people think of anthropomorphism, they tend to think of physical anthropomorphism, hence my usage of the naturalist anthropomorphic distinction. And that leads us to the second term we need to define: furry. In its simplest usage, furry is merely an interchangeable byword for anthropomorphic animal. But this definition is often confused by the myriad uses it sees in popular culture. These days, furry serves as a genre descriptor for any work of art that features anthropomorphization of animals, a term for anthropomorphic animal characters within those works, a label for people who generally enjoy anthropomorphic content, the subsection of those fans who are active within the broad, loosely knit cluster of communities centered around anthropomorphic content, known collectively as the furry fandom, the collective fandom itself, and the subsection of people within the fandom who cosplay as anthropomorphic characters. Hopefully this gives some idea of the confusion surrounding the term. Just imagine if, for the fantasy genre, fantasy meant not only books, movies, and illustrations within the genre, but also elves, orcs, dragons, and so on, and people who enjoyed that content, and people active in communities centered around that content, and the collection of communities itself, and cosplayers using that aesthetic. Suffice it to say that while both anthropomorphic and furry have quite broad applicability as terms, even just when discussing literature, in this video, we will be limiting ourselves to a very specific subsection of books that include, and are predominantly told from the perspective of, physically anthropomorphized animal characters. Also, while there are plenty of furry comics, manga, and graphic novels out there, such as Beastars and Orin's Forge, I will not be covering those here, even though I recommend both, with the caveat that Beastars can be rather all over the place after the first few arcs. And yes, I technically fall under the third definition. You all can stop asking now.
I knew it!
In fact, I've even published several short stories in the genre as part of the Furry Historical Fiction Society, a collective of authors who have been releasing anthologies inspired by various historical epochs featuring anthropomorphic animals. So, one for prehistory, another for the classical era, the Middle Ages, and so on. I've had a story featured in each of the first 3 volumes, the latest of which released earlier this year. And while the stories themselves encompass a wide variety of genres, tones, and general approaches to anthropomorphism, I chose to write each of my stories in a different era of a shared far future setting where humanity has gone extinct, and several mustelid or adjacent species such as weasels, stoats, martens, otters, and so on have evolved to sapience. Think Redwall, but written for older audiences. Additionally, my debut novel, Winter Without End, a work of naturalist rather than anthropomorphic animal xenofiction, is available from Fenris Publishing, and you can find links for all of these in the description. With all that said, let's dive in. Anthropomorphism, or attributing human traits to non-human things, be they creatures, objects, natural forces, or even concepts, is one of the oldest and most significant elements of our species' collective cultural heritage, and as we emerged into consciousness in a world full of myriad other animals, it should be no surprise that they often work their way into our imagination. But seeing as how this video will be focusing on literature, I think it is important to draw a distinction between fiction and mythology. While mythological stories typically develop as attempts to explain some aspect of existence or convey some form of truth, and may belong to or be incorporated into a religious framework, fiction is designed largely with the intention of entertainment, and with the understanding from the outset that the story is constructed by the author. And I know that this only scrapes the surface of this subject, but I don't think it would be a good use of our time to delve into epistemology and truth-fact distinction in a video about furry literature. So while animal anthropomorphism in one form or another has featured prominently in religions around the world, cropping up everywhere from ancient Egypt to the pre-Columbian Americas, pagan Europe in all its diverse varieties, the steppes of Eurasia and the Far East, and even the Abrahamic cultures of the Levant, when narrowing our focus to anthropomorphic fiction, the story of our subject begins with the fables of the ancient world. Most people in the West will have at least a passing familiarity with the fables, many of them involving animals, attributed to the Greek slave Aesop, and dating in that form to the 5th century BC, though they may be less familiar with the similar traditions found in the Indian subcontinent, the Buddhist Jataka and Sanskrit Panchatantra. Contemporary scholars believe that the fabulist tradition, or the literary practice of developing fables for the purposes of moral instruction or passing on wisdom, originated somewhere in Mesopotamia in the 1st millennium BC, and may have served as either the direct source or a form of loose inspiration for both Greco-Roman and Indian fables, which would help to explain a few common tales and elements. Alternative hypotheses include the tales being developed independently by either the classical-era Greeks or Indians, and then spreading along trade routes to the other well over 2,000 years ago. But whatever their origins, the Greco-Roman fables would serve to establish the first proper literary anthropomorphic tradition in the Western world. However, the anthropomorphism employed in these fables was typically either ambiguous or primarily mental in nature. The characters of the lion and the mouse, the scorpion and the frog, and the fox and the crane may possess humanoid mental attributes, but physically, they remain ordinary wild animals, or at most may be given slightly more dexterous grasping digits. There was, however, one notable exception to this. Possibly the first work of proper literary fiction in human history to feature physically anthropomorphized animals was the Greek comic epic The Batrachomyomachia, or The Battle of the Frogs and Mice, a parody of the Iliad involving the two warring species, and most likely having been written sometime in the 4th to 2nd century BC. Regardless, as amusing as ancient Greek audiences may have found the tale, it lacked any true staying power in the Western cultural consciousness, and exists more as an amusing obscurity for classicists, who continue to debate its authorship to this day. In fact, it was not until more than a millennium later that proper physical anthropomorphism, of the kind most modern audiences are familiar with, would emerge in the written historical record, with the publication of Nevardis's Isengrimus, a Latin mock epic predominantly centered around the rivalry between its titular wolf and his nemesis, Reynardus the Fox, who would come to be far more widely known as Reynard. And as the clever fox upstaged his foe in popularity, as he so often did in the stories themselves, the Isengrimus would give rise to the Roman de Renard, a cycle of loosely related stories that came to captivate audiences across Western and Northern Europe well beyond the Middle Ages. I myself have covered the topic extensively in an earlier video, but for our purposes here, it suffices to say that the Reynardian cycle thoroughly established the concept of physically anthropomorphized animals in European popular culture, and by the time of the late modern period, this influence would bear fruit beyond localized derivations of the Roman de Renard. One notable exception is the Italian story of Puss in Boots, likely predating its first publication in the 1550s, though it is possible that this tale itself drew some inspiration from the character of Reynard the Fox. However, while many stories and fables from the late Middle Ages through the 19th century would come to feature anthropomorphic animals, beyond the variations and derivatives of the Reynardian cycle, these characters were nearly always ancillary, rarely the primary focus, and almost never the perspective character, as in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, Carlo Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio, and some of the fables collected and reconstructed by the brothers Grimm. However, this would change around the turn of the 20th century. Strange as it may seem, given both the genre's far older roots and immense popularity today, the contemporary literary tradition of physically anthropomorphized animals is actually a good deal younger than that of its naturalistic counterpart. While isolated, extremely obscure stories told from the perspective of physically realistic animals can be found as far back as the 1700s, including Dorothy Kilner's 1783 The Life and Perambulations of a Mouse, William Hopwood's 1804 Biography of a Spaniel, and Arabella Argus's 1815 The Adventures of a Donkey, none of these ever established this technique to any significant extent in popular culture. And it was not until Anna Sewell's 1877 novel Black Beauty that a coherent genre would begin to form around the concept. As discussed in my earlier video on the topic of naturalist animal xenofiction, by the first decade of the 20th century, novels and short stories told from the perspective of non-physically anthropomorphized animals had become one of the dominant genres of fiction. Writers such as Ernest Thompson Seton, William J. Long, Charles G.D. Roberts, and Jack London achieved widespread commercial and critical success. But alongside their works, an adjacent subgenre began to establish itself. In 1898, the same year that Seton revolutionized naturalist xenofiction by attempting to embrace a more realistic portrayal of animals' mental faculties, Albert Bigelow Paine went the opposite direction, publishing the first entry in his Hollow Tree series, the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This collection of short stories features a community of physically anthropomorphized animals who live in the titular deep woods, with possum, coon, and old black crow sharing a dwelling in the Hollow Tree itself, interacting with various neighbors, including Mr. Rabbit and Mr. Turtle. Paine would go on to publish 2 other collections continuing these characters' storylines, which are unique in being among the first fiction published, at least in the Western world, that remained primarily focused on anthropomorphic animals while not being directly derived from the Roman de Renard or classical fables. Beatrix Potter would follow close behind with the publication of The Tale of Peter Rabbit in 1901, though interestingly enough, her manuscript at least partially predated the publication of the first Hollow Tree book. Potter's debut began in the form of a series of letters written to entertain a friend's child in 1893, and was initially self-published before being picked up by Frederick Warne & Co. a year later, whereupon it went on to become one of the best-selling children's books of all time. Potter would follow up her debut with stories featuring a number of other species, including mice and squirrels, all existing in a vaguely human manner. In another example of anticipating modern trends, Peter Rabbit would also become the first commercially licensed fictional character in history. Rounding out the establishment of modern anthropomorphic animal fiction, Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows, published in 1908, would cement the popularity of physically human-like animal characters among general audiences. While all 3 of these authors were immensely popular in life, the memory of Paine's work has largely diminished in comparison to his 2 contemporaries. However, despite Graham's novel being enjoyed by readers of all ages, these works did undeniably cater to younger audiences, and appealed to the lingering Victorian sensibilities of the time, in particular growing disenchantment with industrialization and the resulting societal upheaval, featuring relatively uncomplicated morals, lack of challenging or socially controversial material, reverence for idyllic rural communities, and a celebration of an existence immersed in, or at least close to, nature. Over the next few decades, A. A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh books, Michael Bond's Paddington series, Eve Titus's Basil of Baker Street books, and E.B. White's Stuart Little would only further the idea in the public consciousness that books featuring physically anthropomorphized animals were intended for children. Though I should clarify that, technically speaking, according to the book, Stuart Little is actually a human who just looks like a mouse in every way and is the size of one. I'm not making that up. But for all intents and purposes, it's still xenofiction as far as I'm concerned. George Orwell's Animal Farm and Mikhail Bulgakov's Heart of a Dog, 2 fables highly critical of Soviet communism, are among the few stories to feature physically anthropomorphized animals aimed at older audiences from this time, while Brian Jake's later Redwall series, geared towards younger readers, would see massive success, and Gary Kilworth's fantasy saga The Welkin Weasels would push the boundaries in terms of age ratings. However, in the latter half of the 20th century, the world of anthropomorphic literature would also change with the advent of the furry fandom. With roots in the underground comic scene of 1950s America, which would often parody the family-friendly funny animals seen in cartoons produced by Warner Brothers and Walt Disney Studios, the most well-known among these being Fritz the Cat, and influenced by the rising popularity of Japanese animation and comics in the Western world, the furry fandom primarily began with an interest in visual arts, subversive attitudes regarding socio-political norms, and general irreverence towards what the artists involved saw as the too rigid, constricting, and serious attitude of mainstream American culture. Gaining prominence gradually throughout the 60s and 70s in the emerging convention scene, and later spreading through the early internet, the furry fandom, as it came to be known, eagerly took up the cause of championing anthropomorphic artwork in all its myriad forms, including literature. For a more in-depth look at the community itself, I highly recommend Frederick Knudsen's Down the Rabbit Hole episode on the subject. But suffice it to say that, though built around the enjoyment of stories featuring humanoid animals, art produced within the fandom was primarily visual in nature, with illustrations, paintings, comics, and even costumes taking precedence over written works. Steve Gallacci's hybrid political military science fiction series Albedo, beginning its run in 1983 and hailed as one of the first serious furry stories, took the form of a comic. Likewise, the celebration of artwork from outside the fandom largely remains centered on animation and other visual media. However, beginning in the late 70s and accelerating throughout the following decades, With the advent of more accessible options for those interested in self-publishing fan magazines, and later starting independent publishing houses, a small but dedicated section of the fandom began to develop around written fiction featuring anthropomorphic animals. Meanwhile, the fandom itself would become more mainstream and diffuse with the rise of the internet, and the popularity of anthro-animal fiction aimed at older audiences would spread beyond its bounds. Owing to the risks and costs of publishing novel-length material, and the relatively limited target audience, much of the writing produced within the fandom has taken the form of short stories, initially featured in fanzines, and nowadays often released as anthologies centered around a certain theme, setting, or time period. Given the outsider-aligned nature and radical and transgressive roots of the furry fandom, it may be no surprise that a significant amount of the written work produced within the community, much like the visual art, is erotic in nature, which is neither my area of interest or expertise. And as it is my desire to keep this video appropriate for general audiences, and to avoid getting this channel smacked by YouTube, I will only be briefly mentioning works of this nature here. However, not safe for work material by no means encompasses all furry fiction. Fred Patton, one of the most prolific critics within the fandom, who was also active in the fields of science fiction and fantasy, as well as anime and manga, edited a number of safe for work short story collections, and Fur Planet, one of the fandom's largest publishers, periodically releases volumes of its own general audience anthology Roar, in addition to the more adult-oriented Heat and Fang. Additionally, anthropomorphic stories of varied age ratings and genres, written by those working either on the periphery of the fandom or entirely outside of it, have only become more common with the continued mainstreaming of speculative fiction of all varieties. With the origins of anthropomorphic animal literature established, it's time to delve into the different subcategories within the genre. As mentioned earlier, for the purposes of this video, we will be leaving out stories that feature non-physically anthropomorphized animals, such as White Fang and Watership Down, regardless of the extent to which the characters are mentally anthropomorphized. But if you are interested in those types of stories, I covered the genre quite thoroughly in another video. Unlike with naturalist animal xenofiction, the history and development of anthropomorphic animal xenofiction doesn't fit as neatly into eras or epochs. And again, any type of classification is going to be at least somewhat arbitrary, so please understand that these categories are largely of my own devising, which I personally find to be useful. Also, I'm probably just going to start saying anthro because anthropomorphism, anthropomorphic, anthropomorphized, and anthropomorphization are quite a mouthful. First is what I'll call the hybrid anthro subgenre, which features anthro animals existing in our world alongside human beings, whether they are a result of magic, genetic engineering, or convergent evolution, or, originally, with no explanation at all. These works are most common in the early history of anthro-animal fiction, where humans and humanoid animals live alongside one another without any in-world justification. Though more grounded iterations of the subgenre have been making a comeback within the furry fandom recently, and plenty of mainstream authors have made use of this approach over the years, particularly when writing science fiction and urban fantasy. Many works that technically fall into this category would not generally be considered overtly furry or anthro if the animal characters remain secondary, as is often the case. Second is the secret world anthro subgenre, in which anthro animals exist within our world unnoticed by mankind, with a few possible exceptions. This is where plenty of the classic mice and or rat-centric books come in, many of which have had their fame elevated through animated adaptations, such as Basil of Baker Street and Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim. Anthro animals in these stories often retain a realistic size, and anthropomorphization typically remains limited to a few species, most often rodents, though dogs and cats may be mentally anthropomorphized while remaining physically realistic. Third is the secondary world anthro genre, which features anthro animals in a world other than our own. These stories may also feature humans or other non-animal based sapient species, such as plenty of novels in the Star Wars Expanded Universe, or they may restrict sapience solely to anthro animals, such as the Redwall and Green Ember series, or my own short stories mentioned earlier. Within the furry fandom, these types of stories tend to predominate in speculative fiction, i.e. fantasy and sci-fi. The fourth subgenre actually already has a name, and that is the Coffeeshop Fox subgenre, or alternatively the Fox and Starbucks subgenre, if you don't mind having trademark names in your descriptors. These stories feature anthro animals as stand-ins for human beings existing in our world, often with only minor adjustments for the sake of immersing the reader, and are most common in the furry fandom, especially among romance and slice-of-life stories. And lastly, we have what I will label the Semi-Anthro subgenre, which contains stories that straddle the boundaries between naturalist animal xenofiction and physical anthropomorphization. These are stories where the animals use tools in an unrealistic manner, and may even construct buildings, furniture, or rough clothing, while still retaining realistic physical forms, like the Guardians of Ga'Hoole, where otherwise realistic owls forge metal weapons, or Rotha's Creature, where sapient big cats harness fire and herd prey animals. Humans may or may not be present. I suppose a lot of the earliest classical and medieval era works, such as the Batrachomyomachia, Roman de Renard, and many fables, would possibly fall here as well. These don't quite fit under the umbrella of NAX in my view, so I excluded them from my earlier video. And though they don't quite fit here either, I personally think they have more in common with stories like Redwall than they do with Watership Down. And of course, there are going to be cases of overlap between these subgenres. For instance, the setting of C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia shifts between our real world and a fantastical secondary world that contains anthro animals, though not exclusively, while Brian Jake's Redwall series is set in a secondary world that, at least in the first novel, apparently contains humans and was possibly originally intended to be medieval Europe. Regardless, let's begin where the modern tradition of anthro animal fiction itself did, with the hybrid anthro subgenre. While the first anthro animal fiction was arguably produced in the ancient world, the genre's contemporary tradition dates back to the turn of the 20th century, with the trio of authors I mentioned earlier, Albert Bigelow Paine, Beatrix Potter, and Kenneth Grahame. The Hollow Tree series, Peter Rabbit and its various offshoots, and finally The Wind in the Willows, all published within 2 decades, each sold millions of copies, and established not only the popularity of stories with anthropomorphic animals in the broader cultural consciousness, but also their intended demographic of younger readers, as well as the general rules of the emerging genre. The first fictional anthropomorphic characters of the modern age would live much in the manner of human beings, walking upright and wearing clothing, inhabiting houses with furniture, using tools, and even driving vehicles, sharing this semi-fantastical world with normal human beings. Where there is interaction between humans and anthro animals in these types of stories, it is generally treated as something quite mundane, if a bit quirky, but attention is rarely drawn to the logic, or lack thereof, in the arrangement. And in many cases, certain wild animals, or domestic ones such as dogs or livestock, may still behave as their real-life counterparts, as in the case with Roald Dahl's Fantastic Mr. Fox. Almost certainly the best known and respected of the entries in this subgenre of anthro animal fiction, Kenneth Grahame's The Wind in the Willows was constructed from bedtime stories told to entertain the author's chronically ailing son, and follows the adventures of an anthropomorphic toad, mole, water vole, and badger. It is a novel deeply ingrained in the values and atmosphere of the English countryside amidst which it was written, published, albeit with great difficulty, at a time when nostalgia for the nation's rustic past was reaching a crescendo, as the continent grappled with the rapid and far-reaching changes brought on by industrialization, and teetered on the brink of a new, terrible breed of mechanized warfare. The series of mostly unconnected tales, many of which involve the eccentric aristocrat Toad's misadventures, follow the aforementioned amphibian, the stern yet wise badger, the humble, intelligent mole, and the easygoing, river-loving Ratty, as they live their lives in an idyllic, simplistic conception of rural England. It is the type of world that is seen through the eyes of a child, a place full of the excitement of adventure with the sharper edges blunted, where the promise of a cozy home always remains in the background, in which the troubles of the modern age rarely encroach, and even then, usually only to the level of mild inconvenience and general amusement, as in Toad's automobile-related run-ins with the law. However, despite its intentional childlike innocence, or perhaps because of it, the novel has continued to speak to readers of all ages in the more than a century since its publication, almost as if its avoidance of a more mature or realistic handling of its subject matter highlights the bounds of a child's understanding of the world, giving glimpses into the greater, more complicated universe looming beyond. Perhaps best encapsulated in Ratty and Mole's encounter with the ancient god Pan when searching for a friend's missing son. And despite its rooting in late Victorian and early Edwardian England, Grahame's writing has never struggled to find an eager readership abroad. Unsurprisingly, despite being largely lambasted by critics at the time of its publication, The Wind in the Willows garnered widespread acclaim from audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, to the point where President Theodore Roosevelt, who keeps appearing in my Xenofiction videos, wrote a letter to the author praising his work. My own views on the novel are a little more mixed. Despite having a deep level of appreciation and respect for it, Grahame's prose and story have never quite managed to reel me in the way they have for so many others, though I will die on the hill of Ratty being one of the most endearing characters in children's literature. But if you're looking to get into the genre, or just want an understanding of where it began, regardless of your age, this is definitely a worthwhile place to start. Though Graham himself never wrote sequels to The Wind in the Willows, a number of other authors have taken it upon themselves over the years, the most prolific among these being William Horwood, who also appeared prominently in my prior Xenofiction video. Horwood wrote a series of sequels that have been generally well received, of which I have read only the first, The Willows in Winter. Personally, I think Horwood does a fairly good job at emulating Graham's writing style, though, and you'll forgive me for the cliché, his own writing lacks that ethereal, magical quality that permeates the original, and he doesn't really seem to understand Ratty as a character. Over the following decades, as anthro-animal fiction became largely confined to the realm of children's literature, the hybrid anthro subgenre's popularity declined in favor of the emerging secret world subgenre, which we will discuss next. And this isn't exactly surprising, given that one of the core elements of this subgenre's early history is its roughness around the edges, owing to it being the progenitor of broader contemporary anthro-animal fiction. There doesn't seem to have been much thought given to the reasoning behind normal human beings living alongside inexplicably human-like animals, because these stories draw heavily from a pre-rationalistic era in which empirically coherent world-building wasn't something audiences expected from their fairy tales. In a strange twist, it could, I suppose, be argued that H.G. Wells' 1896 novel The Island of Dr. Moreau was actually the first work of the hybrid anthro subgenre, featuring a mad scientist who performs surgeries on wild animals to both physically and mentally alter them into human likeness. But this work remained all but disconnected from the popular strains of anthropomorphic animal literature in the decades that followed. As the broader landscape of fantasy fiction evolved and exploded in popularity, thanks in large part to the immense creative labors of J.R.R. Tolkien, and as general audiences subsequently became more invested in coherent world-building, while the rising furry fandom opted for stories devoid of humans entirely, this subgenre has mostly fallen by the wayside. However, in recent decades, some authors within the latter community, as well as a few outside it, have revisited the hybrid anthro approach, injecting it with added realism by justifying the existence of their anthro-animal characters living alongside humans, either through magic, genetic engineering, or other means. Tim Sussman, better known by the pseudonym Kyle Gold, typically writes in the Coffeeshop Fox subgenre, and will be discussed in more detail there, but his Collations series follows the adventures of the young fox Kip Penfold, a member of a magically created group of anthro-animal races, as he attends a school for magic in an alternate history Napoleonic-era America, where the colonies never won independence from the British Empire. Additionally, a number of short stories from collections edited by anthropomorphic critic and historian Fred Patton utilize this technique, the stronger of which include Tony Greyfox's Distant Shores, featuring a human astronaut from around our own time who is awakened after a cryosleep incident by a salvage party of genetically engineered mice, Tom Mullen's Shells on the Beach, telling a tale of similarly engineered anthro rats fighting discrimination as they serve in the British Home Guard in the Second World War, and Alice Dryden's Remembrance, following anthro jackals who evolved via convergent evolution and are drafted into the colonial forces of the Royal Army in the First World War. One of my favorites of these short stories is from the first Dogs of War anthology, Jefferson P. Swiffaker's Strike, But Hear Me, a semi-satirical tale of a genetically augmented, power armor-encased rattlesnake soldier navigating the hazardous terrain of both battlefields and military politics. Set in a world that has taken von Clausewitz's maxim of war being politics by other means to the extreme, where human military governments have engineered animals to fight alongside them, as casual, limited warfare is used in the routine process of diplomacy and negotiation, the snake finds herself caught up in a combination labor dispute/coup d'etat, and despite being somewhat absurdist, the story still does a great deal to develop its world and cast. You could arguably count this as secondary world anthro-animal fiction, since the specifics of the setting aren't given beyond a vague science fiction future, but it certainly embodies the principles of the later hybrid anthro subgenre. Speaking of, my personal favorite works in this subgenre, and two of the best pieces of anthro-animal fiction in general, are found in Malcolm F. Cross's Semi-Anthro duology, Dog Country and Mouse Cage, a pair of novels that are both undeniably furry, insofar as they fully utilize and explore their protagonists' existence as anthropomorphic animals, and simultaneously feel at home among mainstream, contemporary, grounded science fiction. Set primarily in the early years of the 22nd century, albeit told in not entirely chronological order, the author constructs a setting that feels both disturbingly possible as a light cyberpunk semi-dystopia, and yet unnervingly familiar to the present. Vast swaths of Russia, Kazakhstan, and China have been devastated in the Eurasian War of the 2060s and 70s. Chemical, nuclear, and biological fallout from the conflict has further threatened the already precarious global ecosystem. From the ashes of failed states in equatorial South America, the Middle American corporate preserve operates as a late capitalist nation-state and financial juggernaut with international reach. Drones and 3D printing are ubiquitous. Nuclear fusion appears on the cusp of being feasibly commercially utilized. Fighting is dominated by electronic warfare, and advances in genetic engineering have trickled down to the lowest rungs of society. And, most importantly for the purposes of these novels, anthropomorphic animals, colloquially referred to in universe as furries, were developed in the mid to late 21st century by Estian Industries, designed from several species for various purposes, before the government ended their collective existence as corporate property and bestowed upon them legal personhood. Which brings us to the first of the novels, Dog Country. Though sections of several chapters are told from the perspectives of a few of his clone brothers, the spotlight primarily falls on Idane Estian, a humanoid dog designed for one purpose only, to be a soldier. The only problem is, after 7 years of intensely disciplined upbringing, he was freed from the program, along with his brothers and all of the other genetically engineered anthropomorphic animals, declared a legal person, and adopted by a human family in a process known as the emancipation. After a childhood of struggling to adapt to human norms, Idane enlisted with a private military corporation alongside a number of his brothers, before being wounded and returning to the quiet suburbs of the MACP. But in spite of his comfortable life, the dog soldier still feels a vague longing for purpose, only exacerbated by the fact that he knows exactly what he was made to do: fight and kill. And so, when several of his brothers form a communally organized PMC and take on a contract to overthrow the repressive dictatorship of Azerbaijan, crowdfunded by the country's own citizens, Idane is faced with a choice. Does he linger in his current malaise in the hopes that things will eventually settle, or embrace what he was literally born to do and rush halfway across the world into yet another war zone? All in all, Dog Country is a solid military science fiction story, serving as a strong introduction to Malcolm Cross's rich near-future setting, and comprising a fairly light read, which is not in any way something that could be said of Mouse Cage. The second of Cross's Semi-Anthro novels is longer in word count, deeper in characterization, as well as narrative and thematic complexity, and far, far darker in terms of subject matter. Where the former certainly contains its genre-standard moments of violence and gore, trauma and mourning, there are not infrequent points in which Mouse Cage feels like the emotional equivalent of being forced to swallow broken glass. And given that I mean that as a compliment, I must elaborate. Mouse Cage tells the story of Troy Salcedo, an anthropomorphic black-furred mouse created, like his 23 brothers, for laboratory research. Categorized by their human overseers as Class C specimens, the 24 clones were subjected to experiments with absolutely no ethical or legal restrictions. Experiments which claimed the lives of 3 of the 24 brothers before Troy's outbursts during a corporate audit resulted in the emancipation. In their status as companion pieces, I cannot help but think of the contrast between Jack London's 2 Xenofiction masterpieces, The Call of the Wild and White Fang, the former involving a domestic dog going feral, and the latter a wild wolf becoming tame. But unlike in London's most celebrated works, there is no moral equivocation here. The Estians of Dog Country, raised to be strong and capable, instilled with discipline and a sense of grander purpose, look on the emancipation with emotions ranging from disillusion to outright despair, and even once free, gravitate of their own volition towards the military service for which they were created. But for the surviving Salcedo brothers of Mouse Cage, the emancipation quite literally saved their lives from an existence too horrible for most people to comprehend. And yet, because of their traumatic experiences, despite their strenuous efforts to move on, in many ways they remain trapped years after they first emerged into the sunlight from the labs of Lake North. Idane pines for the security and certainty of doing exactly what he was created for. Troy spends his every waking moment desperately trying to forget that purpose. While far from the only one with even visible scars, he bears the most prominent mark of their shared past, a prosthetic arm, designed by his mechanically skilled brother Saigon. Plagued by recurring nightmares, Troy is further burdened with overwhelming guilt over the part he was forced to play by the scientists in experimenting on his own brothers. Of the 24 Salcedo mice, 3 never made it out of the labs, and 7 have died since, of disease, murder, accidents, and even suicide. Each loss another crushing reminder of the protagonist's own inadequacies. And it is at a charity fundraiser, forced to relive a portion of his trauma in front of a selection of wealthy donors, that he meets Jennifer Dixon, a genetically engineered thylacine working various odd jobs, including as an erotic dancer. When their initial failed one-night stand leads to a deeper form of intimacy, the two enter into an openly on-again, off-again relationship that Troy finds it increasingly difficult to live with the more he falls in love with her. Mousecage manages to be a surprising number of things in the course of its lengthy and somewhat meandering by design narrative, often at the same time. An erotic romance burning with passion and a tragic exploration of a toxic relationship between two uniquely damaged partners who nonetheless derive crucial support from one another. A gut-wrenching account of survivor's guilt and a tragic slice-of-life family drama. A science fiction thriller and a social commentary piece. A globe-trotting dystopian adventure tale and a grueling account of an addict relapsing under pressure. And, perhaps even more surprisingly, it manages to be all of these rather remarkably well, while never feeling exploitative or sensationalist in even its bleakest and most harrowing moments. In the course of Troy and Jennifer's tangled romance, it is the former's personal journey that remains the central focus, and Malcolm Cross fully delivers when it comes to providing readers with a richly layered, deeply flawed, and yet irresistibly sympathetic hero, coming across as a shockingly, often disturbingly, authentic and relatable portrayal of the human condition. At the core of both of Cross's novels lies a question that anthropomorphic fiction is in many ways uniquely suited to grapple with. What exactly does it mean to be a person? Dog Country certainly engages with this subject, but never with the incisive immediacy that Mousecage does, as the latter fully commits to exploring the existence of a genetically engineered animal living in a human-dominated world that, although set 8 decades in the future, is a strong reflection of our own. For a more thorough discussion of this duology, which itself contains minor spoilers, you can check out my written review, from which elements of this section of the script have been drawn, linked in the description. While in my estimation, Dog Country stands in the shadow of Mousecage, the former nonetheless serves as a solid point of entry to Malcolm F. Cross's highly inventive setting, one that should entice fans of both science fiction and furry literature, while setting the stage nicely for the more visceral experience of its follow-up. And though I have to warn prospective readers that the latter will, or at the very least should, disturb you, will oftentimes throughout its course leave you sick to your stomach and with an aching in your heart, I must add that the ending, although hardly the stuff of fairy tales, does feel like several breaths of fresh morning air after a long, dark night. If hybrid anthro was the subgenre that both established the concept of anthropomorphic animals in the landscape of popular culture and perpetuated the enduring stereotype of said stories being for children, the secret world anthro subgenre took the baton from its predecessor and ran a marathon. Effectively constituting the second wave of the genre of contemporary anthro-animal fiction, works in the secret world subgenre feature anthro-animals, typically only a limited number of species, most commonly rodents, additionally limited in the size and degree of their anthropomorphization, who exist alongside, or more accurately in the shadows of, a normal human world that remains entirely, or at least mostly, unaware of their existence. Beginning in the 1950s, and gaining ground in the world of children's literature over the following decades, works in this genre almost universally star mice or rats whose societies parallel our own, and range from detective thrillers to classic adventure tales to works of science fiction and epic fantasy. Many would achieve even greater fame through major animated adaptations, including Eve Titus's Basil of Baker Street series being adapted by Disney as the unimaginatively named, but undeniably fun The Great Mouse Detective, Robert C. O'Brien's Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim serving as the basis for the masterful and more fantasy-oriented Bluth film The Secret of Nim, and Marjorie Sharp's The Rescuers being adapted into a Disney film of the same name. My personal favorite of these is O'Brien's Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim, which manages to be quite a different story from the admittedly excellent Bluth adaptation. The overt fantasy elements in the latter are entirely lacking in the source, making for a more grounded story, and Jenner remains a background figure rather than a proper antagonist, allowing the novel to focus more prominently on the titular character's heroic struggle to save her ailing son, and later protect her entire family. Readers coming into the story as adults may not get the full experience of its intended younger demographic, but I still give the book a strong recommendation to fans of talking animal stories. Entries in this subgenre remain popular to this day, from Robin Jarvis's The Deptford Mice series to Kate DiCamillo's The Tale of Despero, playing off the enduring popularity of the more general fantasy trope of the secret world, whereby a magical society or element of reality exists alongside the mundane one, unnoticed by most of the population, as in Harry Potter, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, or Lev Grossman's The Magicians. And though the vast majority of secret world anthrofiction either lacks magic altogether, or doesn't utilize it as the reason for their anthropomorphic characters remaining hidden from humanity at large, I'm going to throw a curveball into the script by tackling a novel that effectively blends the two approaches in a story for adults. Or perhaps I should say a double curveball, because while this book features anthro-animals, the perspective characters are the humans who encounter them, so it's not technically xenofiction either. But this novel is one of my favorite reads from the last few years, so I don't care. I'm talking about it here anyway. Jonathan Edward Durham's Winterset Hollow is an exquisitely written novel that follows a trio of young adults on a pilgrimage to celebrate a fictional holiday from their favorite story by visiting the late author's now abandoned island estate in the Pacific Northwest. And I will need to delve into minor spoilers to discuss it in any detail, but I won't touch on any concrete details that can't at least be easily inferred from the rear cover blurb and the opening chapter. In the world of Durham's novel, Winterset Hollow is a celebrated literary classic by Edward B. Addington, a member of an immensely wealthy family of English aristocrats who emigrated to America in the course of their business empire's expansion. This book within a book is, effectively, a pastiche of The Wind in the Willows, The Hollow Tree Snowden book, and the like. A charming, rustic, made-for-all-ages adventure story featuring a community of anthropomorphic animals, which even decades later remains beloved by children and adults across the world for its timeless themes of discovery, perseverance, and belonging. Eamon Buckley, who was raised off the grid by a paranoid father before being passed through various foster homes after the man's abrupt disappearance, connects strongly with the character of Runnymede Rabbit, who in Addington's novel ended up bringing significant change to his isolated community when deciding to venture beyond the comforting confines of his native hollow. As a result of his upbringing, Eamon struggles significantly with social interaction, but has managed to find true companionship with Caroline, a fellow Winterset Hollow fan, and her jovial, sarcastic, carefree boyfriend Mark. Meeting up with a group of fellow fans who have similarly come to celebrate Barley Day, the focal holiday of the animal community of Addington's novel, the group takes a boat ride to the famed author's private island, where, upon exploring the grounds of the estate, they discover that there may have been more truth to their literary idol's magnum opus than previously suspected. It turns out that the anthropomorphic characters of Addington's novel, Runnymede Rabbit, Phineas Fox, Flackwell Toad, and Bing the Builder Bear, exist in the flesh, and, having lived in their apparent patron's manor for decades, invite the human visitors to partake in their annual Barley Day feast. But this reveal is only the first of many in a novel brimming with twists and turns, as despite the initial warm reception by the aging, world-weary rabbit, Eamon begins to sense that something more sinister is at play on the island. Though the story is not actually xenofiction, as it remains focalized in the human Eamon's perspective, the author's talent in character writing is by no means restricted to the human members of his cast. Runny and Finn, as the rabbit and fox are nicknamed, are both considerably complex characters in their own right, with depth that matches, and arguably even exceeds, that of their furless counterparts. So much of their dialogue, even from their introductory scenes, is laden with lavish subtext, to the point that although the novel's action doesn't truly kick off until about a third of the way through the word count, I was so engrossed in the characters and their interactions with each other and the fascinating environment of the Addington estate that I hadn't even thought to care. Perhaps more importantly, Durham uses all of this staging to convey insightful and effective commentary on a variety of topics, ranging from the temptations and corrupting influence of wealth, power, and long-standing privilege to the legacy of colonization, and from the problems with unquestioning popular hero worship to the indelible scars left by various forms of abuse and trauma, all the while avoiding coming off as too blatant or preachy. However, to delve into a more thorough discussion of this novel's handling of any of these subjects would require extensive spoilers, and so I will leave this to readers to discover in their own time. With unwavering commitment to his bizarrely clever premise, a deft balance of contrasting elements and tones, and a great deal of good old-fashioned talent, Durham's Winterset Hollow is one of the most engaging works of fiction featuring anthro-animals that I have ever read. And so, even though it's not proper xenofiction, fans of this genre will still almost certainly find it worth their time. Though works in the prior category continue to be published and sell well, the Secret World Anthro subgenre is still largely confined to the world of children's literature. And while this next grouping began in a similar vein, it has proliferated to become arguably the most diverse category of anthro-animal fiction in terms of age ratings, genre, and general scope. Stories in the secondary world subgenre take place in a setting that is entirely different from our own. Not merely an alternate past, facsimile of the present, or near-future imagining of our own world, but a new one altogether. The only requirement is that there are physically anthropomorphized animals who are prominent in the narrative or setting. Though this video is primarily concerned with Xenofiction, plenty of works in the broader world of science fiction and fantasy employ elements of this subgenre, from the Chronicles of Narnia to the catalog of the Star Wars Expanded Universe, and many of C.J. Cherryh's science fiction novels. And so humans, humanoids, or entirely alien species could exist alongside anthro-animal ones. However, to return to the focus of this video, arguably the most famous and celebrated example of this subgenre is Brian Jake's Redwall series, where various anthro-animal species inhabit a world very much like the European Middle Ages in terms of culture and technology, but still distinctive. This seems to have spawned a subgenre of its own, given the proliferation of novels featuring anthro-woodland creatures in a vaguely medieval setting, from Jake's own 21 sequels to Gary Kilworth's The Welkin Weasels, the Mistmantle Chronicles, or the Green Ember books. And while I dipped my toes into each of these series for the purposes of this video, their being written for children generally made it difficult for me to get all that invested. Kilworth's series, of which I read the first 2 books, was certainly my favorite of the bunch, and I have to admit I've never found Redwall all that narratively interesting, though coming to the books as an adult probably didn't help. A notable outlier in this subgenre is Daniel Polanski's novella The Builders, which is described on the rear blurb as Redwall if it were written by Sam Peckinpah. For all you younger viewers, he's the guy who made the old Western movie The Wild Bunch. The point is it's violent. It's a very violent book. Kind of to the point of being goofy with how edgy it is, as this scarred outlaw mouse reassembles the members of his gang to take down a former ally who betrayed them, but the writing style is quite engaging, and I have to admit the premise is pretty cool. However, despite the next subgenre that we will discuss being more popular among writing produced within the furry fandom, a number of prominent authors, among them Mary Loud, Francis Pauly, Rick Griffin, and Greg Luderman, have created their own science fiction universes inhabited, either partially or entirely, by anthropomorphic animals. And this subgenre remains highly popular among short stories from the themed anthologies I've mentioned earlier. In one of the more unique incarnations of secondary world anthro-animal fiction, Visiting New Places features the story Why Indeed by Pepper Hume, in which an anthro-feline investigator for a spacefaring government agency is tasked with investigating a murder on a pacifistic planet that has recently opened itself up to external relations. While the furry future, unsurprisingly, contains a number of stories in the subgenre. Dwale's The Darkness of Dead Stars, easily one of the standouts of the collection, is an existentially bleak horror tale set in the far future, in which genetically engineered humanoid mole rats crew a vessel drifting endlessly through the infinite depths of space, in search of potential stars that have not yet burnt themselves out. Ronald Klemp's Evolver is another tension-filled deep space exploration piece involving a crew of anthro-animals searching for the species who created them, while Mary Loud's Lunar Cavity follows the blossoming of an unlikely friendship between a member of a bat-like alien species seeking to save his planet from astrological catastrophe, and one of the human scientists he has managed to recruit. Additionally, a number of the short stories in the Furry Historical Fiction Society's anthology volumes, When the World Was Young, In the Light of the Dawn, and The Heavens Within Our Grasp, including 3 of my own, fall under this category. That being said, my personal favorite writer in the realm of secondary world anthro-animal fiction is Michael H. Payne, though one of his stories, To Drive the Cold Winter Away, featured in the anthology Visiting New Places, partially falls under the secret world genre as well. What initially brought Payne's writing to my attention was Emergency Maintenance, from the aforementioned science fiction collection The Furry Future. Compiled from 3 of the author's older stories, it is set in a far future science fiction universe where humans have colonized the stars, and engineered anthro-animals, or anthrops, have achieved a limited level of legal personhood, but continue to face significant pushback. This specific story sees Shalise, a weasel anthrop investigator working alongside her cat anthrop husband Lawrence, as the 2 get caught up in a conspiracy involving artificial intelligence and human supremacist terrorists. As a pleasant surprise, this detective thriller is capped off with a poignant moment of religious discussion between Shalise and her human parish priest. Apparently, the author wrote a number of stories featuring these characters, set on the colony world of Marches, in the early to mid-90s, and, at least at the time of the anthology's publication in 2015, was working on combining them into a novel, tentatively titled A Meadow in the Mist. Unfortunately, it seems this was never completed, and despite my best efforts, I have been unable to find any of the other Shalise stories online, or learn where they might otherwise be located, though I haven't yet given up hope. To Drive the Cold Winter Away, meanwhile, begins in a secondary world of anthro-woodland creatures, much like Payne's long-form novels I will discuss in a moment, only for the rat protagonist to get whisked away on a magical adventure and end up in our world. Both stories showcase the author's signature strengths, featuring richly constructed settings brimming with life of their own, thoroughly developed characters who, despite containing an authentic degree of complexity, always remain delightfully endearing and remarkably easy to root for, and graceful prose that never overstays its welcome. Speaking of, Payne's duology of the novels The Blood Jaguar and Rat's Reputation both take place in the same constructed setting, a world highly reminiscent of early anthro-animal fiction, such as The Wind in the Willows or the Hollow Tree books, and possessed of a great deal of the same rustic charm, albeit with broadened cultural and geographic horizons. Payne's animal characters inhabit the same middle ground of anthropomorphism as Graham's Ratty and Toad, not quite so limited as the physically realistic rabbits of Watership Down, and yet not quite so human as the cast of Beastars. In The Blood Jaguar, we begin on the outskirts of the town of Ottersgate, following Bobcat, a former wanderer who has managed to put down tenuous roots, and has partially succeeded in escaping a reputation for delinquency and catnip addiction. After a surreal encounter with a terrifying figure from the myths he never before took seriously, Bobcat seeks out the help of his neighbor Skink, an erudite, if unadventurous, lizard, and Fisher, the local community shaman. The latter pair soon discern that the three, collectively, have drawn the attention of the Curioles, the 12 deities who supposedly govern creation, and become entangled in the latest occurrence of a capitally rendered cyclical myth. Setting out to both stay ahead of the Blood Jaguar, the renegade 13th Curiole prophesies to unleash a devastating worldwide plague, as well as to determine what exactly it is the gods have planned for them, the trio venture across the continent, braving forests and deserts, outwitting mercurial monarchs and conniving cultists, and naturally, learning more about themselves and each other in the process. Their endearing, semi-dysfunctional three-way dynamic adds an additional layer of engagement to the immersive animal world and the author's consistently high-quality prose. For as much as he draws on long-standing literary traditions and influences, be they the works of Kenneth Grahame or ancient myths from cultures around the world, Payne makes a conscious effort to add to the canon rather than merely retreading old ground. The Blood Jaguar is both a classic hero's journey tale and simultaneously a reflection on the component pieces of that very narrative structure, on how the stories we tell shape us, and how our lives, in turn, shape them. Rat's Reputation, meanwhile, spans a much longer period of time, several decades compared to its predecessor's little over a month, and takes a much looser approach to plotting. The hero of this tale is Rat, also known as Rateo, or simply Teo, who was found alone as an infant in the wilderness, delivered into the care of a wandering squirrel caravan by one of the Curioles. However, finding himself the constant target of ridicule and suspicion on account of his status as an outsider, he is soon handed over to one of the prominent mouse families of Ottersgate. From here, readers follow the course of Rat's life through the trials of adolescence and early adulthood, as he finds himself embroiled in juvenile rivalries and long-standing feuds, friendships and crushes, childish pranks, and more weighty run-ins with the law. And while this does eventually entail plenty of globe-trotting across the setting we were introduced to in The Blood Jaguar, Rat's Reputation trades the looming threat of apocalypse for a far more subdued, introspective tale about belonging and identity. At one and the same time, Payne draws more heavily on the style and tone of The Wind in the Willows, while exploring the perspective of outcast species in a way that Graham's novels, with their simplistically villainous weasels and stoats, never bothered to. Rounding out the cast, all three of the heroes from the prior novel make appearances, helping greatly, though in very different ways, to shape the course of Rat's journey. Here, the Fisher from The Blood Jaguar is simply Blaze, daughter of the current Ottersgate shaman, hungry for experience with the Curioles. The younger Bobcat, still in the throes of addiction, is far more vindictive and prone to violence than the mellow character Rat helps him become. Skink, meanwhile, remains much the same, offering our protagonist much-needed companionship when his troubles with his adoptive community drive him into semi-self-imposed exile in the surrounding woods. With its focus on community and belonging comes an expansive cast of characters, allowing Payne to play to another of his strengths. For with the inhabitants of Ottersgate, the author captures the spirit of small-town solidarity in all its forms, from the hospitable and supportive to the insular and provincial. Additionally, in Rat's Reputation, Payne doubles down on the metatextual elements of the novel's precursor. Over the course of his life, Rat finds himself the subject of a great deal of stories, often but not always drawn from the truth, then enlivened with exaggerations for good or ill. This eventually makes him into a sort of Reynardian trickster character, derided as a crude, barbarous villain by certain residents of Ottersgate, and lauded by others as a sly rascal with a heart of gold. Excerpts from these tales, as well as poems and even the occasional academic or pseudo-academic work on Rat's life, serve as epigraphs before each chapter, giving further insight into how our protagonist is viewed by the various communities that he never seems to fit in with, and further exploring the nature and impact of storytelling as an art form, and its central place in culture. As I alluded to earlier, Rat's reputation is far more character-driven and far less narratively focused than the Blood Jaguar, with the 5 sections, titled Rebirth, Raising, Roaming, Reckoning, and Resolution, often serving more as loose collections of chronologically occurring vignettes. And yet, while both novels are certainly well worth the read, I found Rat's journey of personal growth, and his search for a community where he can finally belong, to be the more moving of the 2 tales. However, it should be noted that, by introducing both the setting and several important figures in Rat's life, the first novel lays important groundwork for its successor, even if both remain standalone stories inhabiting the same wider world. Honoring the legacy of The Wind in the Willows while adding his own unique blend of charm and wit, Michael H. Payne's delightful little duology serves as a welcome addition to the anthropomorphic canon. Rising to become the dominant subgenre of literature produced within the furry fandom, especially on account of the massive popularity of slice of life, romance, and erotica, stories in the Coffeeshop Fox genre take place in a world highly reminiscent of our own, often with names for real-world locations, brands, and even historical figures either retained or slightly altered in a way that draws deliberate parallels with contemporary society. This approach is not without its share of detractors, as, in the eyes of some, the works in this subgenre often fail to sufficiently justify the inclusion of anthro-animals, or utilize the element of anthropomorphization beyond an aesthetic redesign of otherwise ordinary people. A line of reasoning I myself have mixed feelings about. On the other hand, proponents of this subgenre argue that the use of fantastically anthropomorphized animals in an otherwise mundane setting allows for additional layers of commentary on subjects like identity, belonging, otherness, and what constitutes human nature while retaining a degree of separation from the real world. The derisive term zipperback, which sounds like a slur but isn't one, originated in the early history of Coffeeshop Fox stories, well before any such label had been applied to them, and referred to anthro characters who behaved so little like animals that they might as well have been humans wearing cheap costumes, the idea being that, metaphorically speaking, the zipper on the back of the animal suit was visible to the reader. Unlike the others, this subgenre's works almost exclusively originate from within the furry fandom, and the name itself comes from perhaps the most iconic work of one of the community's most prolific authors, Tim Sussman, most of whose bibliography has been published under the pseudonym Kyle Gold. Gold began writing as a hobby in the 1990s, self-publishing short stories and later novels before founding a publishing house, Sofa Wolf Press, in 1999. Arguably his most influential and culturally enduring work, the 2008 novel Waterways, begins with the 2 central characters meeting at the neighborhood pool before going to a nearby Starbucks, hence the popular label for the subgenre. Waterways deals with themes common in much of Gold's bibliography, following a teenager on a journey of self-discovery as he falls in love with another boy, and while it can get surprisingly sexually explicit at points, and the author's prose rarely rises above the level of serviceable in my view, the strong characterization and generally nuanced handling of its broad subject matter have made it a staple of literature produced within the fandom. From what I've gathered, much of Gold's writing runs more explicit than my own interests, but if that's what you're looking for, he's a staple of the scene. However, while less predominant than in Anthrofiction's other subgenres, there are still plenty of safer work stories to be found here, particularly in the many anthologies released by Fur Planet, often edited by either Fred Patton or other prominent furry authors. Roar, their general audience rating collection, is currently on its 11th volume, while Patton oversaw a number of anthologies centered around different subject matter, including war, travel, religion, and science fiction. And though many of the stories contained within these fall into other subcategories, 2 of my favorite Coffeeshop Fox stories include Cross of Valor by John Culp and Thebe and the Angry Red Eye by David Hopkins. The former is a moving, no-holds-barred first-hand account of a traumatized veteran's war-on-terror-style deployment before an assembly in his hometown, while the latter is a gripping tale of an astronaut marooned on one of the Jovian moons after an emergency. Think The Martian, but as a tragedy. Another author who undoubtedly deserves a mention here is Madison Scott Clary, whose works, particularly the collections Restless Town and A Wildness of the Heart, actively strive to push the literary boundaries of furry fiction, and in my own view comprise some of the strongest entries in this subgenre. The first of the 2, Restless Town is formatted as a standard anthology, containing a number of short stories that, while not directly connected in terms of narrative, share in common their status as slice-of-life stories featuring anthropomorphic characters, often touching on themes of romantic attraction, sexuality, and identity, with specific focus on mental health and confronting trauma. Some of the stories do get rather explicit, both in terms of sexual content and depictions of depression, suicidal ideation, and other related subject matter. And though the breadth of the stories makes it likely that readers will not find every one of them equally compelling, the author's prose remains elegant and graceful throughout, with her characters' portrayals, regardless of their diverse situations, and despite their existence as anthropomorphic animals, never failing to feel thoroughly human. My favorite story from the anthology, Every Angel is Terrifying, manages to be simultaneously beautiful and soul-crushing in its depiction of a young dog suffering from bipolar disorder. Honorable mentions include Overclassification, which tells the story of an otter with obsessive-compulsive symptoms working as a college librarian, who takes in a young homeless woman during a blizzard, and Disappearance, following a weasel fleeing from an abusive relationship, attempting to start life anew in a small town. The second of the two, the much more safe-for-work A Wildness of the Heart, is likewise a collection of slice-of-life stories featuring anthro animals, though in this case a few much shorter works bookend a larger novella, Limerent Object. Like many of the other stories, the novella follows a young adult in the small city of Sawtooth, Idaho, grappling with romantic feelings, the protagonist in this case being D. Kamana, a Catholic coyote on the autism spectrum, who left the seminary several years prior to pursue a career as a therapist, despite remaining devout in his faith. As he begins to ponder more deeply his decision to abandon the priesthood, and more broadly ruminate on the process of discernment in his life, D comes to the realization that he is falling in love with his closest friend, K, whom he met at university, and with whom he remains in regular contact. Told primarily through entries in his journal, and rounded out with the occasional relevant email or text conversation, the protagonist of Limerent Object has moved beyond the burning years of adolescence to settle into a mostly comfortable, mostly stable professional existence, and yet he remains plagued by a nebulous, vestigial sense of youthful anxiety about his trajectory in life, about how he was able to make such an important decision on such short notice, and why said decision received no pushback from the church itself. In all the works I have read that belong to this subgenre, this central novella remains the most personally engaging and endearing, but even those who cannot connect to Scott Clary's characters as directly should still be able to understand them thoroughly, and empathize with their experiences. The various tales of A Wildness of the Heart, diverse as they are, contain a refreshing degree of relatability, presenting slice-of-life stories that are as easy to fall into as they are likely to remain in the reader's mind long after the final page has been turned. Stories possessed of not only appeal beyond the traditional boundaries of anthropomorphic literature, but the ability to speak more directly to real-world human experiences. From the sessions D runs with his clients to the now complicated conversations he fumbles through with the subject of his newfound affections, and from the coyote's recounting of his own therapist's advice to recollections of his time in first the seminary and later the public university where he met Kay, Scott Clary's prose settles the reader into the moment with an effortless grace. A poignant reflection on the complicated feelings that nearly all people grapple with during at least some points in their lives, brimming with romantic passion and yet constructed with a mature restraint, and possessing a subtle intimacy that permeates nearly every page. A Wildness of the Heart manages something truly special with the deceptively brief glimpses it provides into the lives of its various characters who will likely live on in the memory of readers long after the final page has been finished. Lastly, we have what I term the Semi-Anthro subgenre, a sort of catch-all for the works of anthro-animal fiction that don't really fit into any of the four preceding categories, but also feature characters who are too anthropomorphized for me to classify them under naturalist animal xenofiction. This includes stories where the animals are mostly realistic, but possess some limited capacity for tool usage, or communicate with humans, as is the case with many of the earliest works of anthro-animal fiction. The Roman de Renard, Puss in Boots, and even the Batracho Myomachia would arguably fall into this category, and for those interested in the former, I have an entire video on the central character. However, stories in the semi-anthro subgenre remain alive at present both in animal fantasy for younger readers and on the more experimental side of furry fiction. The Guardians of Ga'Hoole series, as well as its spin-offs, where owls and other animal characters create metal tools and have crude dwellings that are still more sophisticated than their real-life counterparts, are likely the most well-known example today of what I have in mind when discussing this type of anthro-animal fiction. Though I personally prefer Claire Bell's Book of the Named series, which tells the story of prehistoric big cats who have evolved to an early level of sapience, and engage in the herding of prey animals and the utilization of primitive tools, The first novel, Rotha's Creature, contains an interesting and well-developed protagonist in the form of Rotha, a young member of the community known as the Named, who struggles to find a place in the adult hierarchy and is eventually cast out, forced to find her own way in the world. Written in quite an engaging style, and utilizing an extremely unique and creative premise, this tale of revenge and survival, despite fitting the label of young adult, should easily appeal to Xenofiction fans of all ages, though it does get rather graphic at brief points in more ways than one. The first entry's success spawned 4 sequels, of which I have read the first 3, and though some of the latter books can be hard to find physical copies of, I believe the series is in the process of having new editions released. Clan Ground, the second novel, sees the leader of the Named facing threats to her young rule from both within and without her clan, and while not quite reaching the adventurous and groundbreaking heights of the first novel, should still whet the appetites of fans of its predecessor as it further develops Rotha's character. The third novel, Rotha and Thistlechaser, takes this element even further, and sees Rotha confronting the sins of her past as she attempts to ensure the survival of her clan, featuring the proper introduction of an interesting foil to the fire-taming leader. The fourth, Rotha's Challenge, follows the core surviving characters attempting to overcome a puzzling new situation in the form of a strange group of big cats, and while it lacks the narrative weight or intensity of earlier novels, and one element in particular greatly strained my suspension of disbelief, the further development undergone by both Rotha and Thistlechaser probably make the book a worthwhile read overall. I will admit that it did dampen my interest in continuing, though there's a good chance I'll get around to reading Rotha's Courage at some point. Additionally, while the Semi-Anthro subgenre is far from the most popular among writers in the furry fandom, some of the more creative approaches to stories featuring anthro animals from the aforementioned anthologies do fall into this category. From the furry future, Brian Fair's story Vivian follows a group of programmers developing and raising an artificial intelligence, the titular Vivian, who exists within virtual reality and takes the form of a humanoid fox. Rob Baird's The Third Variety, in Dogs of War, concerns genetically engineered sapient dogs used to sniff out robot infiltrators amidst a global war between humans and machines. And the follow-up anthology's Dog Extended by Karen tells a fairly grounded tale of cybernetically enhanced sniffer dogs working alongside human soldiers deployed to the Middle East in the near future. Gods with Fur also features 3 light-hearted, mostly comic stories of this nature that I enjoyed. 400 Rabbits by Alice Dryden, involving a lower status member of the Senzon Totokten from Aztec mythology, attempting to find a greater purpose beyond their life of hedonism. Contract Negotiations by Field T. Mouse, following the mythical Norse squirrel Ratatoskr attempting to earn a promotion while navigating the divine version of office politics by placating his bickering, temperamental bosses. And Yesterday's Trickster by Night Eyes Dayspring, featuring the Native American trickster god Coyote attempting to survive in a world that has mostly forgotten him. On a related note, Michael Berge's duology New Coyote and Coyote Season do something similar, and though these arguably fall under the classification of divine rather than animal xenofiction, with their protagonists being gods who simply take the shapes of animals, the same could be said for the prior stories as well. And at this point we're getting pretty deep into the semantic weeds. Anyway, New Coyote and Coyote Season follow the adventures of the reborn Native American trickster god Coyote, who is resurrected in the 1980s with the help of genetic engineering, and forced to adapt to a modern world that no longer believes in magic and myth. Raised by a hippie who never truly left the 60s behind on her cannabis farm in the Pacific Northwest, Coyote attempts to rediscover and master his own powers while evading local hunters, enduring raids by narcotics officers, outwitting FBI investigators, and confronting an assortment of his fellow mythical creatures, not all of whom are entirely pleased to see him walking the earth once again. Told from Coyote's perspective in a humorous, self-aware style, and undoubtedly leaning into the wacky nature of their premise, these 2 novels are goofy, bizarre, and a whole lot of fun, while also possessed of a solid emotional core. Lastly, The Navigating Fox, by Christopher Rowe, published as recently as 2022, is set in an alternate Earth where the Roman Empire never fell, its reach now spans across the Atlantic, and an alchemical means of raising other animals to sapience has been employed for several hundred years. Told from the perspective of the fox Quintus Schual, the only known knowledgeable or speaking member of his species, as he both recounts the failure of his prior expedition and embarks upon a follow-up, the whimsical style and creative world-building make it easy to fall into, though the rapid pacing of this fairly short novella left me feeling rather underwhelmed, as it seems to end just when we are getting a better sense of the cast and the broader world they inhabit, both of which I'd definitely like to see more of. And there you have it, an overview of the genre of anthropomorphic animal xenofiction, with a few adjacent works thrown in for good measure. Obviously, the immense breadth of the genre, in which more works continue to be published every year than I could reasonably read, means that this video provides more of a jumping-off point for those interested in exploring further than a comprehensive bibliography. But I hope I've given everyone a solid place to start in terms of major works, authors, publishers, and the like. However, don't let that stop you from sharing your own recommendations that I missed in the comments. Whether they are proper xenofiction works or merely feature anthro animals in a prominent secondary role, I'm always looking for new stories to read, and you all have been pretty great about finding obscure works in the genres I discuss that are worth checking out. For example, I originally learned about Brian Carter's xenofiction books solely because someone mentioned a black fox running in the comments on my original NAX video. In addition, feel free to share your thoughts on the works featured in this video. A few sections of this script regarding specific works and authors were adapted from my reviews for Furry Book Review, which will be linked in the description for those looking to learn more. And speaking of active members of the fandom, I would like to thank the wonderfully talented Kenket for once more allowing me to use her artwork in the thumbnail. As mentioned before, I've written a few anthro animal stories myself for the FHFS anthology series, all of which are set in a far future version of Earth, long after humanity has gone extinct and a number of other species have evolved to our level of sapience and tool usage, with strong themes of historical recurrence inspired by Walter Miller Jr.'s A Canticle for Leibowitz. There's Mark of the Stranger, set in the equivalent of Iron Age Greece, following an outcast wanderer who stumbles into a small village while grappling with the sins of his past. The Merchant and the Martyr, set in pseudo-classical Rome, where a wealthy yet disillusioned merchant is roped into a senatorial conspiracy involving a rapidly spreading messianic religion and a plot to assassinate the consul, and The Abbey of St. Vera, which takes place in an analog medieval Europe on the cusp of widespread religious upheaval, as a number of strangers from different social strata seek shelter in a remote abbey, only to find that a murderer is hiding among them. Additionally, for those interested in stories of a more naturalist bent, my novel Winter Without End is available in both ebook and paperback format from Fenris Publishing. Think The Call of the Wild crossed with Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Lastly, you can follow me for updates and support the channel on Patreon if you're so inclined. As always, links for everything can be found in the description. Thanks for watching, and good hunting.
My ghost sleeps on the floor. He can't sleep 'cause there's music next door. I'll stay awake in case they need a band. He stays awake 'cause he's a nervous young man. I can't drink because the bars are closed. I can't go out 'cause I don't have nice clothes. Katie brought a deck of tarot with her. I got my fortune read, I didn't hear a word. Everybody hates a clown. Everybody dies and drowns. Everybody throws a party. Everybody throws a funeral. My dad's ghost hides under the bed with a joke that'll knock 'em all dead. And all my enemies and all my friends are on the floor right above my head. My identity's a compromise. My potential has been fetishized. And my soul has been psychedelicized. Everybody hates a clown. Everybody dies and drowns. Everybody throws a party. Everybody throws a funeral. Get your swords out. Get your swords out. Open up in every way. Get your words out. Get your words out. What the hell are you trying to say? Get your swords out. Get your swords out. I'm the only one fighting this war. Get your words out. Get your words out. I don't want this on the record anymore. smaller, and I stole every single song that I wrote from my 17-year-old ghost. But I'm haunted every day by all the lyrics that he threw away. So if there's one thing he forgot to say, I hope it wasn't I love you, 'cause I do. Everybody hates a clown. Everybody dies and drowns. Everybody throws a party. Everybody throws a funeral. I had a dream that when I was in my coffin, I was in my coffin, I had a dream that when I was in my coffin, I was in my coffin,
with the hybrid anthro subgenre. Are there there's foxes screaming outside. Oh my gosh. That's kind of fitting, actually.